A retired canine dog named Ranger refused to give up on a little lion cub called Leo after authorities took the cub away. Against the cold, hunger, and even a pack of wolves, Ranger fought to protect him, and together they walked more than 600 kilometers across mountains and storms. Along the way, they met strangers who showed kindness, poachers who set traps, and a boy who risked himself to set them free. At last, Ranger limped home into the arms of his owner, Lucas, while Leo was given a safe place in a sanctuary nearby. And though a fence now stood between them, the dog and the lion still looked into each other's eyes with a bond that distance could never break. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel to watch the next stories by clicking the subscribe button right below this video. Thank you. Amen. The late autumn wind swept across the city of Denver, carrying with it the sharp scent of dry leaves and the faint tang of snow lingering on the horizon. The sky was streaked with pale silver clouds, and every exhale from the people walking along the narrow sidewalks turned white before dissolving into the chill air. Denver was always this way in November, restless, waiting for winter's hand to fully tighten its grip. Amid the noise of traffic and the hum of daily life, a small brick townhouse sat quietly in a neighborhood just outside downtown, where a young man named Lucas Turner lived with his mother and his dog. Lucas was 24 years old, lean and tall, with an easy posture shaped by years of running between classes and long shifts at the hospital. His hair was sandy brown, perpetually messy, as if he never quite had the time to smooth it down. His eyes were hazel, bright but lined with the fatigue of a man balancing too many responsibilities at once. Lucas was a medical student in his final year, juggling textbooks, clinical rotations, and the quiet but heavy responsibility of caring for his mother. Despite the exhaustion, there was a steady warmth in the way he carried himself. Patients often remembered his calm voice, and neighbors often smiled at his habit of helping them with groceries or shoveling their walks without being asked. He had grown into adulthood quickly, not by choice, but by circumstance. His mother, Terry Turner, was in her late 40s, though her weathered face sometimes made her seem older. She had once been a proud Army medic, known for her quick hands and sharper instincts, but war had left its mark. After her deployment overseas, she returned home carrying more than physical scars. Post-traumatic stress disorder lingered in her like a shadow that refused to leave. Terry was a petite woman, barely over 5'5", with a wiry frame that had lost its strength but not its defiance. Her dark auburn hair, streaked with gray, was usually tied back in a no-nonsense bun, and her eyes, once fierce, were often clouded with distant storms. Yet, when she smiled at her son or reached down to stroke their dog, she became softer, almost the woman she used to be. Lucas was her anchor, and without him, she sometimes feared she would drift too far into the tides of her memories. The third member of their household was Ranger, a 7-year-old German Shepherd canine who had been retired from service 2 years earlier. Ranger was a magnificent animal, muscular, broad-chested, with sable black and tan fur that caught the light like polished metal. His right ear bore a small tear from an altercation during his service days, and his amber eyes held both intelligence and a kind of weary nobility. Ranger had been trained for search and rescue and detection, but more than that, he had been a soldier's partner. He was loyal to the bone, disciplined, and calm in chaos. Despite his strength, he had a gentleness with Terry that Lucas often found remarkable. Ranger seemed to understand her moments of panic and would rest his head on her lap, grounding her until her breath slowed. He was more than a pet, he was family. It was on a particularly cold morning when fate began to shift for the Turner family. Lucas had just returned from a night shift at the hospital, his scrubs hidden under a heavy jacket, and Ranger padded faithfully beside him as they cut through an alley to reach home faster. The alley smelled faintly of gasoline and old rain, but it was quiet. Too quiet. Ranger stiffened, his ears pricked, and his body lowered into that familiar, alert stance. Lucas trusted his dog's instincts without question. From behind a stack of discarded crates came a sound, a faint, pitiful cry, not quite like any dog or cat Lucas had ever heard. He crouched, his hazel eyes narrowing, and Ranger stepped forward first, nose twitching. There, hidden beneath a piece of torn tarp, was a bundle of golden fur, trembling. It was Leo, though the name would not be given until later. At first, Lucas thought it was some kind of large kitten, but when the creature lifted its head, blinking with enormous amber eyes, he froze. The tiny creature had short but rich golden fur, a rounded face, and small budding paws too large for its fragile body. Its whiskers twitched as it let out another thin cry, the sound carrying desperation. "My God," Lucas whispered, realizing what he was seeing. "It's a lion cub." The cub was barely a few weeks old, frail, ribs visible beneath its coat. Lucas had never seen one outside of a zoo or a television screen. He glanced at Ranger, whose body remained tense but whose tail flicked low, uncertain but not hostile. Slowly, carefully, Lucas scooped the cub into his arms, feeling its fragile weight and the warmth of its tiny body pressed against him. Later, the authorities confirmed what Lucas suspected. There had been a raid the night before on an illegal wildlife trafficking ring operating out of a warehouse near the rail yards. Several animals had been seized, but in the chaos, one cub had escaped this cub. Leo. The arrival of Leo changed the Turner household almost immediately. For Terry, the cub was a reminder of fragility, and she found herself drawn to bottle feeding him, her hands steadying with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. For Lucas, it was another responsibility, one he was both terrified and determined to take on. And for Ranger, it was a challenge. The K9 watched Leo carefully, his protective instincts sparking, but there was no aggression, only curiosity, and, in time, a reluctant affection. Ranger would lie near the cub's blanket, his massive frame forming a barrier between Leo and the world. But Denver was not kind to such stories. Within weeks, word spread. Leo was a lion, after all, not a house pet. Neighbors whispered, city officials raised concerns, and soon Lucas found himself facing letters from the authorities. The Denver Municipal Code was clear. Dangerous wild animals could not be kept in private homes. No matter how young or vulnerable, Leo was considered one of them. The night before the decision was enforced, Lucas sat on the porch, Ranger at his side, and Leo curled against his chest, purring faintly like a broken engine. The air was bitter cold, the sky dusted with stars. Terry sat inside, the glow of the television flickering against her tired face, but her eyes never left the window. "I don't want to let him go," Lucas said softly, scratching Ranger's neck. "But if it keeps him safe, maybe it's what we have to do." Ranger gave no answer, only pressed closer, his warm body steady against the chill. The following morning, an official van from the State Wildlife Department arrived. A woman in her 30s, Officer Sarah Whitmore, stepped out. Sarah was tall and slender with a no-nonsense demeanor. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and her gray eyes carried a mix of authority and quiet sympathy. She had worked in wildlife relocation for nearly a decade and had seen countless tearful partings. Though her face was professional, her heart tightened when she saw the young man holding the cub and the way the German shepherd stood defensively by his side. "We'll take him to a sanctuary 600 kilometers south," Sarah explained gently. "He'll be with professionals. He'll be safe." Lucas's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with the weight of inevitability. He placed Leo carefully in the transport crate, whispering goodbye. Ranger pressed his nose against the bars, letting out a low whine that startled even Sarah. It was not just a pet's cry, it was the sound of a soldier losing his comrade. As the van pulled away, Ranger lunged forward, restrained only by Lucas's command. The German shepherd's amber eyes locked on the fading vehicle, his body trembling. Hours later, when Lucas believed Ranger had calmed, he realized the mistake. Ranger slipped away, driven by instinct and loyalty, determined to follow. By the time the Turners noticed, Ranger was already gone, the city stretching endlessly before him, his nose fixed on the faint scent of Leo carried in the wind. It was the beginning of a journey neither man nor beast could yet comprehend, a road carved by loyalty, and one that would stretch for hundreds of miles. The morning after the van pulled away with Leo, the streets of Denver were still wrapped in the pale light of dawn, the frost crunching beneath Ranger's paws as he followed the faint scent trail that clung to the air. He had slipped away from the Turner household in the silence of night, a soldier acting on instinct, not thought. The city around him hummed with traffic, heaters rattling in apartment blocks, children huddling at bus stops, yet none of it registered in his amber eyes. His focus was fixed ahead, where the smell of the cub lingered like a whisper. For Ranger, the world had narrowed into one mission: find Leo and bring him home. At first the trail was simple, asphalt and exhaust fumes masking only part of the van's passage. Ranger moved with purpose, weaving through alleys, past neon-lit diners and shuttered storefronts. His body was powerful but already tiring. His back legs, stiff from past service injuries, reminded him that he was no longer the young K9 who had once leapt barricades without hesitation. Yet the memory of his years in uniform fueled him forward. He had belonged to Officer Daniel Harker back then, a man with sharp blue eyes and a booming laugh, who had once pulled Ranger out of the rubble of a collapsed building during a rescue. Ranger remembered the dust, the pain, and the steady voice telling him, "You don't quit on me." That command still lived in him, etched deeper than scars. The city thinned as Ranger pushed further south. By midday he had reached the outer stretches, where the skyscrapers gave way to warehouses, and then to open roads bordered by skeletal trees stripped bare for winter. His coat thickened against the wind, but his stomach gnawed with hunger. The Turners had always kept his bowl filled, but now there was only the world cold, indifferent, demanding. He lowered his head to sniff at discarded wrappers near a roadside rest stop, only to be shooed away by a truck driver, Harold Jenkins, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and grease-stained hands. Harold wore a faded baseball cap and a thick jacket zipped up to his neck. He barked out a laugh when he realized the dog wasn't a stray mutt but a German shepherd with piercing eyes. "What are you doing out here, soldier boy?" he muttered, tossing him a crust of bread. It wasn't much, but Ranger snapped it up with gratitude before moving on. By dusk, exhaustion set in. Ranger sought refuge near an abandoned barn on the edge of farmland. The scent of hay and mice filled his nose, but another smell rose above it, familiar, though faint. A soft cry, high-pitched, desperate. He froze, ears flicking forward. Against all odds, Leo was there. The cub had been moved into a separate transport for rest before continuing south, but in a twist of fortune or misfortune, the poorly latched cage door had opened during a stop. The young lion had stumbled free, wandering until his fragile legs carried him here. His golden fur was dulled by dirt, his wide eyes watery with hunger and fear. Ranger approached slowly, tail low, his protective instinct burning through fatigue. Leo blinked, let out a weak mewl, and staggered toward him. Against Ranger's flank, the cub pressed as though he had found the only safe place left in the world. The reunion was wordless, instinctive, but powerful. From that moment, they were no longer separated travelers. They were companions bound by necessity and loyalty. The days that followed tested them both. Ranger led, nose to the ground, moving by instinct and the lingering scent of the van's path southward. Leo followed close, sometimes stumbling, sometimes lifted by Ranger's muzzle when the cub collapsed into snowdrifts. Hunger stalked them both. Ranger scavenged when he could, a half-eaten sandwich discarded outside a diner, scraps from trash bins. Once he hunted, his body remembering training as he flushed a rabbit from underbrush. He delivered the kill to Leo, who nibbled uncertainly before instinct took over. Nights were harder. The cold seeped into their bones, and Ranger used his bulk to shield Leo, curling around him in the hollow of tree roots or the lee of an abandoned shack. In the silence, Ranger's mind drifted back to his service days. He remembered the sharp commands, the crackle of radios, the faces of men he had saved and the ones he had not. He remembered the explosion that had ended his career, leaving his hind leg weakened. Yet he also remembered loyalty the way Officer Harker had refused to leave him behind, even when ordered. That loyalty had brought him to the Turners, and now it propelled him forward for Leo. One evening, as the sky bled red behind the Rockies, they encountered another figure on the road. A woman in her early 40s named Janet Rivers was unloading supplies from her dusty pickup near a roadside diner. She was short and sturdy, with dark curly hair tucked under a knit cap, her cheeks ruddy from wind. Janet was a traveling vendor who sold crafts and baked goods at small-town markets, known for her blunt honesty and soft heart. She spotted Ranger first, standing watchful with the cub behind him. Instead of fear, her eyes softened. "Well, aren't you two a sight?" she murmured, crouching to offer a piece of jerky. Ranger hesitated but accepted cautiously. Janet didn't press, but she left scraps of food near her truck before driving off, glancing back in her mirror at the unlikely pair. Her small act of kindness carried them another day forward. But kindness was rare. More often they faced suspicion, gunshots echoing once when a farmer mistook them for predators. They escaped into the woods, Leo trembling until Ranger nudged him onward. Storms followed, icy rain turning dirt paths into rivers of mud. Ranger pressed forward even when his paws cracked and bled. Every step was a memory of command, of training, of survival. You don't quit. One night, while sheltering under a collapsed bridge, Leo curled against him, purring faintly. Ranger's eyes stayed open, scanning the darkness. A distant howl rose, long and sharp. Coyotes. The cub stirred, ears twitching. Ranger lowered his head and pressed closer, his body radiating calm. The danger would come soon enough, but not tonight. Tonight, the lesson was patience, endurance. Meanwhile, back in Denver, Lucas Turner scoured the city. Posters of Ranger appeared on telephone poles, and his voice was hoarse from calling. Terry, shaken but resolute, phoned every shelter and police department. Lucas even called Officer Sarah Whitmore, begging for news of the cub's transport. She told him the truth that Leo had vanished during a stop, likely lost to the wilderness. Lucas refused to believe it. Somewhere deep inside, he trusted Ranger's loyalty. If anyone could bring Leo home, it was the dog who had once been trained never to abandon his partner. By the end of the week, Ranger and Leo had covered dozens of miles. They were ragged, hungry, but alive. Ranger's muscles ached, his limp more pronounced, but when Leo stumbled and cried, Ranger licked his muzzle and pushed him forward. The journey had just begun, and though the road ahead stretched far and dangerous, the bond between them had already hardened into something unbreakable. It was the long journey of survival, and neither beast nor man could have known what waited beyond the next ridge. The road south stretched long and unyielding, a ribbon of cracked asphalt and frost-hardened dirt that cut across the Colorado foothills. The winter air was growing sharper each night, turning streams to glass and layering the fields in thin veils of frost. Ranger's paws ached with each step, his pads raw from stone and ice, but his amber eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. Leo padded close beside him, the little lion cub's golden fur dulled by dust, his steps uneven but determined. Their bodies leaned against the wind, two wanderers, stitched together by instinct and loyalty. Late one afternoon, with clouds sagging low and a storm threatening, Ranger caught a scent wood smoke, warm and steady. He slowed, nose twitching, ears pricking forward. Leo whimpered softly, weary from hunger. Together they followed the smell until the land opened into a small valley where a weathered farmhouse sat tucked among leafless oaks. The barn roof sagged in the middle, but smoke curled from the chimney of the house, carrying the promise of food and warmth. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered despite his age. Walter Hayes was in his early 70s, his once dark hair gone entirely silver, combed neatly though thinning. His face was lined deeply, the skin sun-browned and toughened by decades of farming. He wore denim overalls layered over a flannel shirt, and his boots were caked with mud. Walter carried himself with quiet dignity, though his back was bent slightly from years of labor. He was a man who had seen both prosperity and loss. His right hand bore a crooked scar from an accident with farm machinery 20 years ago, and his eyes carried the shadow of a son lost in a car crash long ago. That loss had carved patience into him, made him softer in judgment, though still cautious with strangers. From the doorway came his wife, Margaret Hayes, a woman in her late 60s with salt and pepper hair pulled into a bun at the nape of her neck. She was petite, wrapped in a heavy knit sweater and apron dusted with flour. Her cheeks were soft, her smile gentle, though her eyes carried a sharpness that revealed she missed little. Margaret had once been a school teacher before retiring to care for her grandchildren, though most now lived far away. She had the air of someone used to nurturing. Her first instinct was to notice the trembling cub and the worn dog on her porch. "My lord, Walter," she whispered, clutching the edge of the doorframe. "That's no stray." Walter's gaze hardened at first, scanning the lion cub with disbelief, then softening as Ranger stepped forward, standing protectively between them and Leo. The dog's tail was low but steady, his body shielding the cub. Walter saw not aggression, but loyalty in that stance. He let out a long sigh, lowering his voice. "Get some bread, Margaret. They look like they've been walking for days." Margaret hurried back inside, and within minutes she returned with a plate of leftover stew and thick bread. Ranger sniffed cautiously, then nudged Leo forward. The cub devoured the bread clumsily, his whiskers soaked with broth, while Ranger ate more slowly, keeping one eye on Walter. That night, Walter and Margaret allowed the animals to rest in their barn. The hay was dry, and Margaret laid out old blankets she once used for her children. Ranger curled immediately around Leo, but for the first time in days, both drifted into deeper, safer sleep. As the storm passed outside, Walter sat at the kitchen table with Margaret, sipping coffee. "That lion cub shouldn't be out here," he muttered. "If word gets out, folks will panic." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Look at them, Walter. That dog won't leave him. It's like he's sworn to guard him." She paused, her hand brushing the rim of her mug. "Reminds me of the war dogs they used to talk about, the ones who never left their soldiers behind." Walter nodded slowly, thinking of his own years in the Army Reserve during Vietnam. He had never seen combat directly, but he had lost friends who had, and he carried their memory like stones in his pocket. He understood loyalty, even in animals. Still, he worried. "We can't keep them, Margaret. The law won't allow it. And that dog, he's headed somewhere. You can see it in his eyes." Margaret glanced toward the barn window, where the outlines of the two creatures rested together. "Then we give them one night of safety, and in the morning, we pray for them." The next day dawned pale and brittle, frost clinging to the fields. Margaret carried out warm biscuits and a bowl of milk. She crouched, speaking softly to Ranger. "You could stay, you know. We could take care of the little one." Her voice was tender, almost pleading. She had grown attached in a single night, her motherly instincts stirred by the cub's helplessness. But Ranger only lowered his head, nudged Leo toward the open road. His eyes flicked to Margaret, apologetic yet resolute. Margaret sighed, tears glinting in her eyes. "I suppose loyalty like that can't be tamed." Walter placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "Let them go, Margaret. They've got a path we can't walk." So as the morning sun broke weakly through the clouds, Ranger and Leo moved on. Margaret stood on the porch, her apron flapping in the breeze, watching until they vanished into the distance. Walter raised a hand in quiet salute, as though bidding farewell to soldiers departing for war. Meanwhile, far back in Denver, Lucas Turner was growing desperate. He had visited shelters, police stations, even highway patrol offices, clutching a worn photo of Ranger. His exhaustion was clear dark circles beneath his hazel eyes, his frame thinner from missed meals. One afternoon, he sat across from Sheriff Dean Wallace, a man in his mid-50s with a square jaw, thinning gray hair beneath a brown Stetson, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Dean was a practical man, respected in his county for fairness and blunt honesty. He had served as sheriff for nearly 20 years, having inherited a department rife with corruption and slowly rebuilding trust with quiet determination. He had no patience for bureaucracy, but he listened carefully when Lucas explained. "You're telling me your dog might have followed a van carrying a lion cub?" Dean asked, his voice steady. Lucas nodded. "Yes, sir. Ranger's not just a dog, he's trained. He won't stop until he finds Leo." Dean leaned back, studying him. The sheriff had seen loyalty in many forms between partners, between family members, but rarely this fierce. He tapped a pencil against his notepad. "There's been chatter about a trafficking ring moving animals downstate. If your cub's tied to that, then your dog might be walking straight into danger." Lucas's chest tightened, but his jaw set. "Then I need to find him before that happens." Dean sighed. "I'll keep my ear open. But you should know, dogs on the run, even trained ones, don't always make it home." Lucas refused to believe it. Ranger was different. Ranger had been trained never to quit. Out on the road, Ranger and Leo continued, their bellies full for the first time in days thanks to the kindness of the Hayes. Each step carried them further into the unknown, but also deeper into the story of survival they had already begun to write. The mountains rose before them like gray giants, their peaks crowned with snow that caught the pale light of an overcast sky. Ranger's breath came in steady puffs, each exhale turning to vapor in the cold air. Leo trotted beside him, his golden coat fluffed against the chill, his paws leaving small impressions in the thin crust of snow that covered the forest path. The land had grown harsher since leaving the Hayes farm. The fields and barns of human life had fallen away, replaced by a wilderness that was indifferent, silent, and full of teeth. Ranger's instincts sharpened with each mile. The woods were alive with scents, deer, fox, and the faint acrid tang of predators that prowled the higher ridges. Hunger pressed into both of them. The scraps Walter and Margaret had given were long gone. Ranger had managed to flush out a pheasant 2 nights earlier, and Leo had learned to nibble at its meat, his cub teeth clumsy but eager. But food was scarce, and the cold only deepened the ache in their bellies. By mid-afternoon, clouds had thickened, smothering the sun. The woods grew darker, and Ranger's ears flicked back at the sound of rustling brush. A low growl rippled across the trees. From the shadows emerged the first wolf, lean, gray, its coat rough, its ribs faintly visible beneath. Its eyes were yellow, hungry. Another appeared, then another, until a half-circle of 6 wolves fanned out before them. Ranger's body stiffened, tail bristling, his hackles raised high. He stepped forward, placing himself between the wolves and Leo, who crouched low, trembling but not running. Ranger remembered his training. When cornered, stand ground. He let out a bark sharp, commanding. The wolves hesitated, but hunger overrode caution. The largest of them, scarred across the muzzle, lunged. The clash was brutal. Ranger met the wolf head-on, teeth snapping, his powerful jaws clamping onto the attacker's shoulder. Another wolf darted in from the side, biting into Ranger's flank. He whirled, blood splattering against the snow as his teeth found purchase again. Leo cried out, his small form darting behind a tree, eyes wide in terror. Ranger fought with the ferocity of his canine days, muscles straining, his old training pulsing through him. But age and injury caught up quickly. One wolf clamped onto his hind leg, reopening the weakness left from his years of service. Ranger buckled, but with a snarl he threw his weight, sending one predator yelping into the underbrush. By the time the wolves withdrew, driven off by Ranger's desperate fury, the snow was stained red. Ranger collapsed onto his side, his flank torn, his leg bleeding heavily, his chest heaved, eyes dulling with exhaustion. Leo crept from hiding, his small body quivering. The cub pressed against Ranger, nudging with his head, mewling with desperation. Ranger tried to lift himself but faltered. His amber eyes, once sharp, now held a different plea: survive. For the first time, Leo understood that survival was not a gift handed to him by others. It was his turn to act. Hunger gnawed at him, but he forced himself into the woods, paws stumbling as he sniffed for water. Hours passed, the cub pushing through brush until he found a shallow stream trickling through ice. He lowered his head, lapped at the cold water, then returned to Ranger, his whiskers wet, mewling until the dog drank. That night, Leo attempted what instinct whispered. He stalked small shapes in the snowfield mice, a rabbit startled into a sprint. Clumsy, he failed again and again, until finally he pounced at just the right moment, his paws pinning a rabbit beneath. The kill was messy, instinct overtaking hesitation. He dragged the prey back to Ranger, dropping it clumsily against the dog's muzzle. Ranger lifted his head, weak but responsive, and began to eat. Leo nibbled too, learning through necessity. For days, their roles shifted. Ranger lay still, conserving strength, while Leo ventured cautiously out, always returning before nightfall. The cub grew bolder, his golden fur streaked with dirt, his small muscles hardening with practice. He found berries under thickets, water from melted snow, and small prey enough to keep them alive. He licked Ranger's wounds clumsily, curling against him at night, the warmth of his body offering comfort the dog could no longer provide fully. One evening, while Leo prowled the edge of their camp, a figure appeared on the ridge above. Caleb Fisher, a ranger in his 30s, stood with binoculars slung around his neck. He was tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and a neatly trimmed beard. His jacket bore the insignia of the State Forestry Department, its green faded from years in the field. Caleb's dark brown hair was tucked under a wool cap, his blue-gray eyes scanning the forest with the wary calm of a man who had spent more time outdoors than in towns. He had chosen this life after a childhood spent in foster care, where the woods had been his only refuge. Now, protecting wildlife was both profession and salvation. Through his binoculars, Caleb spotted the unlikely sight, a German shepherd lying bloodied in the snow, guarded by a lion cub no bigger than a house cat. His brow furrowed. He had heard reports of a missing cub from a trafficking bust weeks earlier. Perhaps this was the one. He stepped forward, careful, his boots crunching softly. Ranger stirred at the sound, his head lifting weakly, a growl rumbling in his chest. Leo stood bristling, his tiny frame blocking Caleb with fearless defiance. Caleb stopped, raising his hands. "Easy there," he murmured, voice steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." He crouched, letting them smell his presence. though the dog's suspicion burned strong. After a long moment, Caleb dropped a strip of dried meat on the snow and backed away. Leo sniffed, then nudged it toward Ranger, who ate reluctantly. Caleb lingered for an hour, watching from a distance, then left, marking the location on his map. He planned to return with help, though some part of him wondered if intervening would strip them of the wild strength that was keeping them alive. The days blurred into a rhythm of survival. Ranger's wounds slowly closed, though the scar would remain. Leo grew in confidence, his eyes sharper, his body stronger. Their bond transformed, no longer protector and protected, but equals depending on one another. When Ranger struggled to rise, Leo pressed against him, lending support. When Leo faltered, Ranger nudged him forward, whispering with every action the command that lived inside him, "Don't quit." By the week's end, the snow had deepened, blanketing their path in silence. Ranger managed to stand fully again, limping but determined. Leo padded beside him, taller now in spirit than in size. Together, scarred but unbroken, they stepped forward into the wilderness, the horizon waiting with both danger and hope. The forest had grown thicker as Ranger and Leo pressed farther into the mountains. Pine trees loomed tall, their branches heavy with snow that dropped in sudden clumps as the wind swept through. The air was sharp, biting against Ranger's scarred muzzle as he pushed forward, his limp more pronounced though his eyes stayed fierce. Leo padded behind him, his golden coat streaked with dirt and twigs, his step surer now than in the weeks before. The cub had learned to follow closely, ears twitching at every rustle. Together they had survived wolves, hunger, and cold, but danger in these woods wore many faces, and not all had fangs. Near midday, as the pale sun struggled through a veil of clouds, Ranger caught a scent unfamiliar yet wrong metal, oil and human sweat mingled with the faint odor of blood. He stiffened, his amber eyes narrowing. Too late, the ground beneath him snapped with a vicious clang. A steel trap clamped around his front leg, teeth biting deep into flesh. Ranger let out a snarl of pain, jerking back, but the chain tethered him to the earth. Leo cried out, circling frantically, his paws scraping the snow as he tried to nudge the trap open with his small muzzle. The device was crude, rust-stained but effective, meant for wolves or perhaps bears, but any creature unlucky enough to step into its jaws would suffer. The forest fell silent except for Ranger's ragged breathing and the cub's mules. Then voices. Two men appeared from behind the trees, both in camouflage jackets faded from use. The taller of the two, Jed Carter, was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered with a thick black beard flecked with gray. His skin was weather-beaten, his blue eyes cold, the eyes of a man who had spent years hunting not for food, but for profit. Jed was a poacher by trade, notorious among rangers though rarely caught. His partner, Mick Larson, was younger, early 30s, with a wiry build, a thin scar running across his cheek, and restless gray eyes that twitched constantly as if watching for threats. He was the kind of man who followed stronger wills, driven more by greed than by conviction. "Well, look what we've got here," Jed muttered, stepping closer, his boots crunching on the snow. His eyes lit with cruel satisfaction at the sight of the lion cub. "That's no wolf," Mick whistled low. "Hell, Jed, that's a damn lion. And a shepherd, too, looks trained. We'll make more than a month's wages on this." Ranger growled, baring his teeth, though the trap held him down. Leo hissed a cub's pitiful attempt at defiance, planting himself in front of Ranger. Jed's chuckle was humorless. "Feisty little thing. Easy money." He knelt, pulling a coil of rope from his pack. Before the men could act, a sharp crack echoed a branch breaking under a foot. Both men spun, rifles rising. From between the trees stepped a boy, small against the looming pines but determined in his stance. Caleb Morgan was 12 years old, with messy chestnut hair sticking out beneath a wool cap too big for him. His freckled face was red from the cold, and his green eyes were bright, wide, but not afraid. He wore a patched winter jacket, its zipper broken halfway, with jeans tucked into rubber boots. Slung over his shoulder was a canvas satchel filled with birdwatching gear, a notebook, a pair of scratched binoculars, and a worn field guide. Caleb had grown up in these woods. His father, a logger, had been injured in an accident 2 years earlier, leaving the boy to help his mother care for the family. He had learned early to tread quietly in the forest, to notice details others ignored, Today he had been out tracking birds when he stumbled upon the scene. At the sight of the men in their trap, anger flared hot in his chest. "What are you doing?" Caleb demanded, voice trembling but loud. Jed sneered, lowering his rifle just slightly. "Not your business, kid. Run along before you get hurt." But Caleb didn't move. His gaze flicked to the German shepherd straining against the trap, then to the terrified lion cub pressing close. Something about their desperation struck him deeper than fear. He stepped closer, fists clenched. "You can't take them. They're not yours." Mick laughed, a harsh sound. "Hear that, Jed? The kid thinks he owns the forest now." Jed raised his hand, silencing him. His eyes studied Caleb, calculating. "Go home, boy. You didn't see anything." But Caleb's stubborn streak, inherited from his father, held him in place. He slowly reached into his satchel, pulling free a small slingshot. His hand shook, but his aim was steady. "If you touch them, I'll tell Sheriff Wallace. He knows you're out here. You won't get away this time." Jed's jaw tightened. For a long moment, tension hung in the air, broken only by Ranger's ragged growl. Then Jed cursed under his breath. "Damn brat. Let's go, Mick." The men retreated, muttering threats, disappearing into the trees. Caleb rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside Ranger. His eyes widened at the trap's cruel teeth sunk into flesh. "Easy, boy," he whispered, reaching for the mechanism. He had seen traps before, knew how to work the spring. With effort, he pried it open, and Ranger yanked his leg free, collapsing with a grunt of pain. Blood stained the snow. Leo licked the wound, whimpering. Caleb pulled bandages from his satchel. His mother had insisted he carry them. He wrapped Ranger's leg clumsily but carefully, his hands gentle despite the tremor in them. "You're safe now," he murmured, as much to reassure himself as the animals. For the rest of the afternoon, Caleb led them along a narrow path only he knew, weaving through gullies and thickets to avoid the return of the poachers. He shared bread from his pack, breaking pieces for the cub, pouring water from his flask into his palm for Ranger to lap. The bond grew quickly, stitched by necessity and kindness. As dusk painted the sky in bruised purples, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley. Below, smoke rose from Caleb's small farmhouse, where his mother would be waiting. He stopped, turning to the animals. "I can't take you home. Mom would... She wouldn't understand, but I'll keep your secret. I promise." He crouched, his hand brushing Ranger's thick fur, then resting briefly on Leo's soft head. His green eyes glistened. "Just don't get caught, and come back if you need me." Ranger pressed his nose against the boy's hand in quiet gratitude. Leo let out a soft chirp, rubbing against his knee. Caleb swallowed hard, then stepped back. He watched until the dog and cub disappeared into the trees, their figures fading into the growing dark. The forest closed around them once more, but now they carried with them the memory of a boy who had risked himself for strangers. The night was colder, but Ranger's limp was lighter with the bandage, and Leo walked taller beside him. They had found, if only for a moment, an unexpected friend. The last stretch of their journey came with the first hints of spring thaw. Snow receded into dirty banks along the roadside, streams rushed fuller with melted ice, and the once barren trees whispered with buds ready to open. Ranger limped forward, his body lean and scarred, his coat dulled by weeks of hardship, but his amber eyes burned with the same unyielding flame that had carried him this far. Leo walked close at his side, no longer the trembling cub who had once hidden beneath tarps and behind hay bales, but a sturdier creature, his golden fur brighter now beneath the pale sunlight, his stride steadier, his gaze more assured. Together, they had carved a bond out of survival. As they crossed into the outskirts of Colorado, familiar scents returned to Ranger's nose gasoline and pine smoke, the perfume of the city's edge. He paused often, nostrils flaring, ears twitching, guiding himself by memory and instinct. Leo followed, curious at every sight but loyal in every step. Meanwhile, back in Denver, Lucas Turner had not given up. He had driven miles placing flyers, his voice hoarse from calling shelters and forest rangers, his hazel eyes shadowed by exhaustion. His once shaggy hair had grown longer, unkempt from nights with little sleep. He leaned heavily on the hope that his dog, the soldier who had never once abandoned a partner, would not abandon him now. Beside him, his mother, Terry, stood stronger than before. Though her PTSD still haunted her, The act of searching had given her purpose. She carried a photo of Ranger in her wallet and spoke more firmly with strangers now, determined to bring both dog and cub home. Sheriff Dean Wallace, gruff and practical, had joined their fight. He had weathered gray hair, a deep-lined face, and eyes that betrayed both weariness and compassion. He had spent weeks pressing state officials, lobbying for an exception that might allow Leo a future in Colorado. Wallace's authority carried weight, but it was his sincerity that convinced others. This isn't about laws, he told them. This is about loyalty, and about a young man's fight for two lives that don't deserve to be separated. When the call came in, it was from Caleb Fisher, the ranger introduced weeks earlier. He had spotted tracks, a shepherd's paw prints alongside those of an unmistakable young lion. The prints led toward Denver. Lucas, heart pounding, drove with Wallace to the reported location, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The reunion happened in a quiet clearing on the edge of town, where the city's noise met the hush of the forest. Ranger limped into the open first, gaunt but proud, his ears pricking as his gaze locked on the figure running toward him. "Ranger!" Lucas's voice cracked with emotion as he dropped to his knees. The German shepherd let out a sound that was half growl, half whine, then surged forward despite his limp, crashing into Lucas's arms. The man buried his face in his dog's fur, tears soaking the rough coat, whispering over and over, "You did it. You came home." Leo stepped cautiously from the trees, amber eyes wide. He had grown his muscles firmer, his chest broader, but he was still a cub, still looking for acceptance. Terry gasped softly, covering her mouth, while Sheriff Wallace narrowed his eyes, not in suspicion, but awe. "Well," Wallace muttered, "there's your proof. No one can deny what's in front of us now." For several tense days afterward, Leo's fate hung in balance. Officials debated. Some argued he must be relocated out of state. But Lucas, with Wallace at his side, refused to surrender. They attended hearing after hearing, Lucas's words trembling but passionate, Wallace's voice steady and commanding. Terry, once too afraid to speak publicly, stood in front of a crowded room and described how caring for Leo had given her strength. "He isn't just an animal," she said, voice breaking. "He's part of what healed us." The tide turned. Thanks to Wallace's persistence and Lucas's plea, the state approved a plan. Leo would live in a new sanctuary being built on the edge of the county, funded by both public donations and government support. He would be protected, cared for by professionals, and remain close enough that Lucas and Ranger could visit. On the day of Leo's transfer, the sun was bright, the air crisp with early spring. The sanctuary stood framed by rolling fields and wire fences, its entrance marked by wooden signs carved with the word Haven Rock Wildlife Refuge. A young woman named Emily Rhodes, the sanctuary's director, greeted them. She was in her late 20s, tall and slender with long blonde hair tied back, freckles across her pale skin, and gentle gray eyes. She had grown up the daughter of a veterinarian, and her life had been devoted to animals from childhood. "We'll give him everything he needs," she assured Lucas, kneeling to meet Leo's gaze. The cub sniffed her hand, cautious but calm as though sensing her sincerity. Ranger stood beside Lucas, watching as Leo was guided into the enclosure. The lion cub paused at the gate, turning back, his amber eyes locked with Ranger's. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then Leo let out a low rumble, not of fear, but of recognition. Ranger's ears perked, his tail lifted, and the two shared a wordless promise. Lucas knelt, wrapping his arm around Ranger's shoulders. His voice was hoarse but steady. "You did your job, buddy. You brought him home." Ranger pressed his head against Lucas's chest, amber eyes still fixed on the cub beyond the fence. The final image was quiet but unshakable. Ranger, scarred but unbroken, sitting beside Lucas and Terry while Leo stood tall inside the sanctuary, golden fur glowing beneath the sun. A fence separated them, but their eyes bridged the gap, carrying the weight of a friendship forged through 600 miles of trial. It was not goodbye, it was a new chapter of survival, one written side by side, even if apart. Sometimes life feels like Ranger and Leo's journey. We face long roads, unexpected storms, and battles we never asked for. But just like them, we are never meant to walk alone. Loyalty, kindness, and the courage to keep going are what bring us safely home. In our daily lives, even the smallest act of compassion helping a neighbor, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, can make the road a little easier for someone else. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope and loyalty. May God bless everyone who watches, and if you believe in the power of love and protection, write Amen in the comments below.